everybody. Hope everyone's having a great day. I sure had a great day. I had 2 exams. That was fun. Welcome to the Wildlife Society meeting. My name is Brylan, if you don't know that. And today we have another seminar series in the Daniel O Traynor seminar series. And like most of you know, we are celebrating our 50th year as a student chapter, so that's what most of these presentations are highlighting, some history of the Wildlife Society and some people who have been notable in the Wildlife Society and how that's impacted their careers. And this is the third one of the 4. So today we have Tami Ryan, who is the Wildlife Health Chief for the Wisconsin DNR. And on November 9th, we'll have Kurt Verkaderen virtually join us to talk about his perspective of the Wildlife Society. A quick thing to note is that happens November 9th, and we do not have a meeting next week because of the National Wildlife Society Conference, so do not show up here because no one will be here. But we will see you November 9th.
Thank you, Brylan. So my name is Jennifer Summers. I'm Program Development Specialist with Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and I'm just here to do some acknowledgments. I'd like to say Brylan helped coordinate this seminar series along with us at Wisconsin Chapter, Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge Brylan for all her work in helping to pull this together, in inviting speakers and establishing this time period to offer up the meeting for a chance for you guys to see some of these really special speakers. And I'd also like to thank Scott Hingstrom, who's the director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and he's also a wildlife professor here. Some of you might have some classes with him. And so I'd just like to acknowledge the College of Natural Resources also, and our other collaborators. So this is something we do every time we have a public gathering. And so these seminars are open to the public. So we recognize the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. And now Scott is going to come up and say a few words about the namesake of this seminar series, Daniel O Traynor.
Thank you, Jennifer, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you here, just to acknowledge Dr. Daniel O Traynor. All of you know that this building really was named after him. He was the first dean of the College of Natural Resources here at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. He was a remarkable teacher. He was very active politically. He served on the Wisconsin Natural Resources Board. He was a strong advocate and an ambassador for the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and just kind of a great all-around fellow. So it's an opportunity for us to further recognize Dr. Traynor through this seminar series. Last year we had this seminar series and it focused on wildlife health. And this year we just had this unique opportunity because of the 50th anniversary of the student chapter to be able to kind of partner with the student chapter and have a focus on the student chapter and this 50th year celebration. But it's my pleasure also to introduce our next speaker who will be for the seminar series, Tami Ryan. Tami is a former student here at UW-Stevens Point. She was active in the student chapter. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in 1988 from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Then she came up here to UW-Stevens Point and worked on a master's degree in natural resources with an emphasis on wildlife, and she received that degree in 1995. She started working with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in their Wildlife Bureau in 1993, and then she became chief of the Wildlife Health section of that bureau for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in 2009. And she said in her little bio, that's where she really found her passion, and that is in working with wildlife health. I have kind of a fun story to tell you, in that the very first time I met Tami, it was at a Wildlife Society annual meeting in Portland, Oregon. And we didn't know each other, and it was after a One Health session that was conducted in the morning, and there was going to be continuing on in the afternoon, and everybody else took off for lunch, and I'm not sure what I was going to do, but I was walking out the door, and I saw a woman sitting at a bench, and she was just looking off, pondering thoughts, and I thought, well, I'd introduce myself. I'm curious who this is. And this is what you do at conferences, really. It's a way that you network with other people in the field. And so I did. I sat down, we started talking. We found out that we're both graduates of UW-Stevens Point, both great friends of Kurt Verkaderen, who's our next speaker coming up. And it just kind of rolled on and on like that. So it was quite remarkable. So another tie to the TWS, I mentioned that she was a member of the student chapter here. Also has been a president of the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society. And just 2 years ago, I think it was, she was a recipient of the Wisconsin Award, which is the highest award that the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society conveys on to its members. So Tam is quite a remarkable person. She's here today to talk about career cogitations and musings, which, from what I gather, she wants this to be interactive. She wants to be able to talk with you and have an interesting and active discussion. So please welcome Tami Ryan. Pocket, and then you can put that in the group.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, hello. Thank you so much for that introduction, Scott. It's very fun to reflect back on that conference back in Portland and the first time that we met. It's a nice story to share. So, all right. Well, I wanted to first start off by congratulating the chapter on your 50th anniversary. What a remarkable milestone for this chapter, and definitely something that's worthy of celebration. And what's really kind of fun, to be in the company of the other speakers. So, the distinguished guests of Eric Anderson, Shelley Dubé, and Kurt Verkaderen. All of whom I have connections with, through my career, and so to be part of this celebration and this seminar series, I'm really honored to be here. So thank you for the invitation. So it's it's been nearly 28 years since I last stood in this auditorium. It's crazy, and the time just flies. But the reason that 20 years ago, the reason why I was in this auditorium was because I was defending my master's thesis. And so to be here now, 28 years later, looking back on how time flies. So Eric Anderson, who you've already heard from, he was a fairly new professor when I started here. So he was just beginning his tenure. And then Kurt Verkaderen, who you're going to be hearing from next week, he and I shared classes together. We walked to school together, and I remember dissecting pigeons on his kitchen table. So it's really kind of fun to have, those connections. And also Shelley Dubé, with her, being the wildlife health professional that she is as well. Certainly she and I have crossed paths over the years, and some of her students I've worked with or have worked for me. So I just thought that was kind of a fun thing to share. Also, I'm curious, how many of you are graduate students? Okay. Well, that's interesting. I thought, when I was here in graduate school, there weren't too many people in the wildlife program that were graduate students, but there were seven of us at the time. So I don't know, what how many graduate students are there in wildlife now?
It's about 7, I think.
Wow, okay. So it hasn't really grown too much then, apparently. But so when I was in graduate school, yeah, there's about 7 of us, and only 3 of us were women. So how many of you decided to pursue wildlife studies because you had an interest in veterinary medicine? You thought maybe I might want to be a wildlife veterinarian. Okay, that's quite a few hands up there. Yep, and so me too. I definitely had that aspiration, but ultimately that's not what happened for me, and my career did lead me on a wildlife health path, though. And I also do currently, and have been for the past 12 years, work very closely with wildlife veterinarians, which is really pretty cool. I really enjoy that part of my job. So, your career paths. Obviously, everyone's on a different track or a different path. You know, how you get to your ultimate destination is going to be different for each and every one of you. And I believe that there will be a time, similar to where I am today, where you're going to kind of look back on your career path and you're going to realize that each step along the way, that career path, led you to ultimately to where you were meant to be. And so that is something that I think maybe you don't realize at this point in time, you know, but there will be a point in time down the road where you'll be able to look up back on that and go, aha, that's why, you know, things went a certain way for me. But ultimately, yeah, to be able to look back and realize you're exactly where you needed to be. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on my education and kind of like the path, I guess, of my education. And so I wanted to start with when I first became a student here at Stevens Point, because it was a little bit out of the ordinary. So I went to UW Milwaukee for my undergrad in biological sciences, and you know, I knew I wanted to be a wildlife veterinarian, but I was trying to take the classes, but you know, you have to get straight A's in order to get into vet school. And some of the coursework that I had in my undergrad, chemistry and physics specifically, were really hard for me. I had to take them over so that I could advance on to the next level. You know, I got like a C-, you know, and I'd have to take it over to move on. And so ultimately, you know, I knew being a veterinarian or going to vet school wasn't in the cards for me. I had a really wise and helpful guidance counselor who met with her on a pretty regular basis, and she, you know, kind of got to know me and what my interests were. And she's the one that made me aware of the College of Natural Resources and UW-Stevens Point, and the fact that there was, you know, a program here for wildlife studies. And I can remember receiving like a catalog, or you know, about the school and the coursework and the activities and things that experiences that you get here, and it just like I knew instantly, like, yes, that's where I want to go. I want to go to Stevens Point. And so I applied for graduate school, and I didn't get accepted. And my heart was broken because my grade point average wasn't really as great as it could have been or should have been to get into grad school. So my heart was broken, and it didn't sit well with me, so I reached out to the assistant dean for the College of Natural Resources and asked him, is there anything that I can do? Is there anything you can do, you know, to help me get into grad school? And he was very kind and polite, but he ultimately turned me away. And I couldn't accept that either. It just didn't sit well with me at all. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to reach out to the dean. And I did. And I kind of made my case with the dean again, and he invited me to come in and meet with him and talk with him. And to this day, I am extremely grateful to Dean Haney, who let me come. He graciously gave me his time. We had a wonderful conversation. He appreciated the passion and the tenacity that I expressed. And he said, you know what, I'm going to give you a chance. But the chance on one condition. And that was that I'd be an undergrad for a year and see if I could bring my grade point average up. So challenge accepted. And that first year, each semester, I was on the dean's list. And I got into grad school. So pretty unique opportunity, but that's my story. That's how I got into grad school. But during that first 2 semesters of attending school here, one of the key reasons why I thrived during those first 2 semesters was because of this chapter, because of the student chapter of the Wildlife Society. I joined the chapter within the first week, And the president of the chapter at the time and the other members of the chapter were so welcoming and so friendly. And I just like, I fit right in, and I knew I was like with family. It felt like, you know, this is where I need to be. And so I took as many opportunities as I could to get involved. And one of the first field trips that I went on as a Wildlife Society chapter member was up to Hawk Ridge to go ban saw-whet owls. I was going to ask you guys, are you still doing that? But I saw it on the board in the hallway that you are. So that's very cool. I have really fond memories of that field trip. When we got up to the location, we were supposed to go camping somewhere, and the campground was full. And so we ended up knocking on the door of some business. And, you know, I don't remember if somebody like knew this person or not, but we ended up camping in this business's backyard just so that we could, you know, have our field trip experience. But yeah, so, you know, I also, as a student chapter, I also experienced things like deer trapping out on Schmeekley Reserve, going out on bear den, checking. And I was, one of my fellow chapter members was Doug Stevens. So I went to school with Doug Stevens. And I can remember the shockwaves that permeated throughout this building and throughout our state chapter upon his untimely death. And so it's really special for me to be here today, also for that reason, because, you know, Scott is the endowed professor, and you invited me to the seminar series. We're in the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. It's also in Doug's memory. So to be able to make that personal connection, I thought would be something you'd like to hear about, something that I felt that I'd like to share. So the close bonds that you share with each other as chapter members is something that's going to last a lifetime, and it's going to be really fun as you continue on into your careers to encounter each other, maybe in other circumstances down the road, and have those connections. I certainly have crossed paths with many of my chapter members from back then throughout my career. And also a lot of the student chapter alumni are frequently encountered, you know, I've had a career in the Wisconsin DNR, and lots of chapter alumni and UW-Stevens Point alumni I've worked with, you know, throughout the years. So it's definitely a prominent presence in the wildlife profession, the UW-Stevens Point, as well as the student chapter. So one last bit of retrospective that I wanted to share with you is back when I was in those first two semesters, one of the courses that I took was the wildlife disease course. And that was my favorite class. And the instructor that taught wildlife diseases when I took it was O Traynor. So I can remember what a great instructor he was, what a kind person he was, how helpful he was, and he really influenced me and in my career choice and ultimate, you know, pursuit of wildlife health. I can really look back on that fondly and feel very fortunate that I was able to be a student of his. So the irony of all of this preamble that I'm sharing with you is just all these connections that I'm just, you know, after being invited here gave me an opportunity to really kind of reflect back, you know, on things in my career path in my life, and to be able to make all these connections to all these VIPs, important, you know, very important people in the history of the College of Natural Resources as well as the student chapter. It's pretty cool that I can make those personal connections. And also to be part of the celebration. All right, so there's so much that more that I could share, I guess, about my educational background. I really wanted to shift gears and kind of switch more into my professional pathway and some of the lessons I've learned along the way, or maybe even, you know, they could be considered tips for success. All right, so lesson number 1. Temporary positions and volunteering are a key to getting a permanent position. So, once as you're going through your educational studies and you're preparing to get a permanent position, employers are really going to look for that initiative, right, and experience. It is a way for you to start building upon the skill set that you're gaining in your education by also integrating some of the professional experience. So like when I was a student here, and also in my undergrad, I did pursue volunteer opportunities in the summer. I worked for the Wisconsin Peregrine Society as a hack site attendant. I volunteered at the Milwaukee County Zoo. And then when I was a graduate student here, I had several undergrad students support me in my research and assist as like field assistants for graduate studies. So I'm sure you're probably aware of that, and that's a really good opportunity too to work with those graduate students and get some experiences that way. Okay, so also on the temporary job front, so I was employed with the Wisconsin DNR as a limited term employee. And it was at a location that I wasn't really crazy about, and I went to school here. I had aspirations for moving out west, and I ended up getting a job in Milwaukee with the Wisconsin DNR, in the city. But it was an opportunity to get my foot in the door, get experience, and it really was an opportunity that did help me develop some skills that ultimately helped me get a permanent position, which is the, whoops, I already switched. So that's my next lesson, is to hang in there. It took me 5 years before as a limited term employee before I got my first permanent job. That's a long time, but again, those 5 years were really valuable. I spent time, so I worked on urban wildlife, urban deer specifically, and coyotes as well. I also worked on state wildlife areas and did, habitat management work on state wildlife areas. And then I also had an opportunity to get some experience in private lands management and did both wetland and grassland restoration work. So that was all kind of within that first 5 years. And then we had this was with the Wisconsin DNR, and we had a realignment during that time frame as well. And I was working for a regional wildlife supervisor who ended up getting a new job. And I ended up, as a limited term employee, fulfilling some of the roles of that position because I had 5 years of experience working with that individual. And ultimately, that really ended up giving me an advantage, I would say, or maybe a leg up when I pursued a permanent position. So that's my next lesson, is to challenge yourself, stretch yourself, work outside of your comfort zone. So my first permanent position with the DNR was as a regional wildlife biologist. And that was a pretty significant stretch. I went from a limited term employee to being a person who was responsible for all the wildlife and endangered resources expertise in the region. And so it was an unusual stretch, but I went for it, and I ended up being the top candidate, got hired, jumped from several rungs of the ladder, so to speak. Typically your progression is going to be stepped, and it was kind of a leap. But it was definitely well worth it, and I wouldn't change a thing. It was definitely, I had to prove myself for sure. But starting with that regional position and then advancing through basically the next 16 years, I went from a regional wildlife biologist to an area wildlife supervisor to a CWD operations supervisor when CWD was first detected here in Wisconsin, and then to a regional wildlife supervisor. So for 16 years, I kind of just progressed, through that field, those various field positions. And I found myself being thrust into the limelight with a lot of emerging wildlife disease topics. I was the regional wildlife biologist when West Nile virus first was detected. I was the point contact in the Milwaukee area where it was first found, lots of media contacts, interactions. And then when I was an area wildlife supervisor in Waukesha County is when CWD was detected in Walworth County, and I ended up becoming a CWD field operations supervisor responsible for all of the field operations and the agency's response for trying to, at that time, we were trying to eradicate the disease from the white-tailed deer herd. So it's really hard to talk about 16 years or 28 years, but so that 16-year time frame and having, and having those opportunities to exhibit leadership caught the attention of the bureau director of the Bureau of Wildlife Management, and he reached out to me out of the blue one day and said, and invited me to, or I would say he actually approached me and requested me to serve an acting role as the wildlife health section chief. And it really came out of the blue. I did not expect this. I didn't know it was coming, and so I really kind of had to think about it, but I didn't think too long because I'm like, well, there's kind of this perception or belief that, well, if you're going to be in wildlife health or if you're going to be the head of the wildlife health program, shouldn't you be a wildlife veterinarian? And it's like, well, I'm not a wildlife veterinarian, but I've demonstrated leadership and, well, why not? Let's give it a try. So I stretched myself and I took the chance and I went for it. And after acting in that capacity for 6 months, they ended up appointing me to the position permanently. Obviously, I wanted that, but I didn't have to compete. They just basically liked the job I was doing and asked me if I would like to continue in a permanent capacity. And I really, truly did find my passion in that period of time. I'm glad that acting assignment was a longer one. Typically, acting assignments are only 6 weeks. This one was 6 months. And so it really gave me insight and opportunity. And I really found that I greatly valued the team and the work that the team was doing, and definitely was very happy to accept that opportunity. So I'm a firm believer in challenging yourself and going out of your comfort zone. And this is where the personal growth happens. And I'm happy to say that, while I thought I wanted to be a wildlife veterinarian, I'm happy to be able to say that I am a wildlife health professional. I have been a wildlife health professional for the last 12 years. And so this is definitely a career highlight for me, the fact how things just kind of came around to wanting to be a wildlife veterinarian, to being the wildlife health program chief. And so during these past 12 years, I found myself continuing to work in chronic wasting disease, becoming the agency expert on chronic wasting disease. I've found myself working on protecting the health of Wisconsin wildlife from emerging diseases such as avian influenza, bovine tuberculosis, and also COVID-19 most recently. I've also been on the forefront of many new initiatives, including the lead action proactivity with our lead action plan and initiatives to reduce lead poisoning in wildlife. I've been on the forefront of wildlife rehabilitation initiatives. And then also translocating elk from Kentucky to Wisconsin. That is definitely a career highlight for me as well. Being so intimately involved in that effort to bring elk up here was just the highlight of my career. I'm very proud of what we've accomplished as a team, and the elk are doing very well. And I never would have had any of those experiences or opportunities if I hadn't stretched myself and hadn't worked outside of and pushed myself to go outside of my comfort zone. All right, lesson number 4, stay connected and involved with the Wildlife Society. As Scott mentioned, I've served our state chapter twice, first as Secretary Treasurer and then as the President of the state chapter. And those experiences were extremely valuable. Not only did it stretch, continuation of the stretching yourself, right, and challenging yourself, but just the opportunity to have that forum of that focus forum in which you can develop and pursue and grow in your profession and support the profession as a whole. I mean, it is the organization for our profession. So I'd also, encourage you, once you leave here and no longer members of the student chapter, I would encourage you to get involved with the state chapter, in a capacity of executive board capacity. So serve the chapter, run for election, become an executive board member. You'll be happy that you did. It's a really great experience. Having the opportunity to design and host training sessions, being involved in the planning of conferences. I've been involved in the National Conference for the Wildlife Society, which also helped me succeed in helping with other national conferences like the Midwest Fish and Wildlife Conference. Currently, I'm on a committee for the Wildlife Disease Association conference, which is going to be held here in Wisconsin next year. So I believe that those student chapter experience, or the state chapter experiences, really helped me in that regard. And not to mention the training opportunities and the networking opportunities. It's, your professional growth and your continuing education is really so valuable, and the Wildlife Society is definitely definitely where you can continue that professional growth. All right, so lesson number 5 is to stay true to yourself and follow your passion. That's probably the most important thing that you can do. That's what's going to guide you and get you to where you ultimately need to be. And then I guess I'd just like to say that the wildlife profession is full of passionate people. And that's not something that's necessarily true for all professions, but it's definitely true in the wildlife profession. And I just want to encourage you to follow your passion. Your time is going to fly by. Look back on things and just be amazed at how quickly time flies, but enjoy the ride and follow your passion. So that's essentially what I thought I'd share today. I purposely kept it fairly high level overview just because I really wanted to have an opportunity to interact. Again, having 28 years of experience is kind of, and I don't want to stand up here and just talk about myself. So I'm really excited to have an opportunity to get to know you. And if there's any questions or anything I can answer for you, or now's the time.
Do you think getting a grad degree helped you narrow down what you want to do, or help you get a job eventually having that master's?
Yeah, having a master's degree is definitely an advantage. I certainly do believe that helped me in my profession, but also in my career. I've been a supervisor now for 19 years. I've hired a lot of people. I've been on a lot of interview panels. And I guess it ultimately depends upon the position that you're going for. I would say, we've hired a lot of really great professionals that do not have master's degrees. It just kind of depends on the position itself. So you know, if your aspirations are to get into the research field, for sure, a master's and a PhD. But if you're, you know, more inclined towards the management kind of side of things, you know, maybe just a bachelor's degree might be all that you need, along with experience. But we just hired some new recruits recently, another class of biologists and technicians. So, and not everybody has master's degrees. Yes?
Do you guys have, does the DNR have any wildlife health opportunities for undergrads at the moment?
At the moment in the wildlife health program, no. However, one thing that I am going to be working on is a new position request for a deer herd health specialist. So we've had pretty happy with the fact that we've had 2 new positions created in the wildlife health program in the last several years. Recently, the most recent position was a wildlife health conservation specialist. So that person is a permanent position that works on deer herd health, but also captive wildlife and wildlife rehabilitation. So it was a position that had long been addressed by limited term employees, and that just was not a good business model. It's something that is in high demand and a growing trend, and so we have that new position. We also have a brand new permanent position for our chronic waste and disease processing center. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 20 years since we first detected it, and we have a facility that we just built. So for most of that timeline, we rented a facility. Now we're actually in a facility we own. It's brand new, constructed. And then we also had a series of really excellent limited term employees that ran the facility, but again, that's not a good business model. We're in the CWD business for the long haul. And so we have a permanent position for the facility as well. So this would be the 3rd new position in the wildlife health program if we're successful. And this person, a wildlife health conservation, or sorry, a deer herd health specialist would be focused on CWD, EHD, bovine TB, any kind of deer herd health matters. So fingers crossed that I succeed with that one as well. Yes?
So, considering the fact that you sat on multiple interview panels, what are some experiences or personality traits that typically stand out to you in person?
Oh, goodness. Well, it's kind of an interesting question, and my mind is going to like a different place because, and I notice also on your board that you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion student group, right? And so I'd say before diversity and equity and inclusion has become such a focus area, which is important and it needs to be, I think some of the things that like I might have said to that answer, like maybe before, like years back, you know, you're supposed to be strong, you're supposed to, you know, be confident, be, you know, don't be timid, have a firm handshake, you know, things like that. And now, you know, with DEI, it's like, you know, I don't really believe those things are true anymore. It really just depends upon, because you could be an excellent candidate, an excellent professional that's going to make a huge difference in the world that might be kind of soft-spoken. And that's okay. You know, so so that's a really hard question to answer. I really think it kind of comes down to, I think in this day and age, it's really more about how best you can answer the questions that you're asked, how best you can relate yourself to the answers to those questions, so that you can demonstrate that you have the skill set, you have the experience, you have the desire. Doesn't matter if you're loud or if you're soft or if you're shy or not shy, you know. It's really just more about who you are and what you have to bring to the employee, to the job. Yes.
My
question is, did you ever apply to jobs that you felt like you underqualified for, and how did you address those kind of hurdles as well as like applying to a job that you didn't think that you could even get?
Well, that very first job that I had as a regional wildlife biologist, I knew that I didn't have the typical stepped background. I still went for it. And I think what I did there was I recognized what my weaknesses were, but then you turn those weaknesses into challenges. So, you turn those weaknesses into positive traits, or you turn them into positives, basically. Recognize that you have a shortcoming. However, I've done this, which is I would do the same thing if in this situation. You kind of have to. It might not necessarily be your analogy. Might not necessarily be relevant to or specific to the job duties, but the action is. And so as long as you can show that you have that rationale and that thought process that's going to get you through it and get you to, you're going to, basically you're demonstrating that you know how you would navigate those challenges and that you've done it before and you've been successful and you recognize what they are and that you're going to address them and just be honest. Yeah. Scott.
I'm curious what you might say to being the most exciting and enjoyable parts of your either current job or past jobs, and then also what might be some of the more frustrating parts of your professional career.
For me, the most exciting part is being able to affect change, to have an idea and have it become a reality. And doing that in a collaborative way. Like I'm a big on teams. You can't do things alone. The teamwork is so strong. And so for me, that's super exciting to have a vision and ultimately have a reality and to be able to celebrate those successes. Probably the biggest frustration is maybe when you have an idea and you're not able to fully realize it because of maybe some of the constraints that may be, one thing that's real in our profession is the social political influences that may come into play. And so sometimes that may deflect, you're on a project, you got an end goal, and then a political or social influence comes in and kind of knocks you off that track. You either have to pivot and maybe divert until you get to that point, but sometimes your point is going to change. Just because you have to be in order. If you can't dig in your heels and be so set on we must do this, when there's other factors at play that you might have to accept a little bit of a lesser final end point, but maybe someday down the road or when circumstances change, you can go back to that point and ultimately get it to where you need it to go. It just might not have been in the time frame that you initially intended. So so things get protracted. Timelines get protracted, and ultimate end goals get sometimes either aren't met or it takes longer to get there. Yes?
So being the chief, what are some effective ways that you have delegated responsibility on some of your colleagues within the department?
Yeah, the delegation is really, what's really key is it's really important to know who you work with, know their strengths, and play to those strengths. So it's not hard for me to delegate. I've got enough to do, but I know, you know, and I meet with people on a regular basis, you know, not just on a professional but personal. It's really important to get to know people on a personal level too. And so when those situations come up and you've got a task or an assignment, knowing who you're working with and what their interests are and what their strengths are is key. And that is, do that all the time. And that's why I'm just so, I'm such a fan of team players, and that's, you know, probably one of the, you know, yes, working with wildlife is awesome. And especially having the hands-on experiences, oh my gosh, you know, that's what everybody wants, right? But in the end, yeah, you know, like the elk project that I worked on, I had a lot of hands-on experience with elk. And I'm really happy, you know, with what we achieved. But what really sticks in my heart and soul is the team and the teamwork, and how every year and every activity, whether it was trapping, transporting, healthcare testing, every team was different, but we made so many awesome connections just because we did it together. You know, and when we first went into that elk project, we were like, we're gonna do what? We're gonna bring elk from Kentucky to Wisconsin? How do we do that? You know, what all do we need to do? And boy, we learned a lot, and we were so hyper focused on making sure those animals are well taken care of and healthy, and that they were going to thrive when they were released. And the passion and the dedication of each and every person that was involved in that project and got that success. Those people all have a very special spot in my heart because of that. So it's really that team dynamic, making those connections and knowing who you're working with and being willing to let go, you know? I mean, my gosh, I don't have to do everything, you know? And I want other people to have experience, and so I'm doling it out as much as I can. Yes?
With being in like a much higher position than you are now, how much like hands-on experience do you have like these days?
Hands-on experience these days, not so much. If I want hands-on experience, I'm going to have to say, hey, you're going to go, like we just recently trapped and translocated rough grouse from Wisconsin to Missouri. If I wanted experience on that, I'd have to like carve time out on my calendar to go up and do that field work, you know. So I'm definitely in a point in my career where that hands-on fieldwork experience is less than what I do, and instead what I do is focus on helping those people who do that work, you know, make their jobs, make sure that our policies are such a way, you know, that we're going to support that work. I mean, I feel like that's why I really kind of transitioned into more of a policy role, even though I really wanted the field work when I was here and I had that field work experience. But at a certain point, things flipped for me when I started serving on our wildlife policy team. And I could see, you know, you hear from your staff about the frustrations or the challenges or the barriers, right, that they're facing. And it's like, well, my goodness, does it need to be that way? You know, active listening and what have you. And it's like, well, we got to fix that. We got to change that. You know, you're facing this challenge or that challenge. Well, why? You know, first we got to learn, why is that there, and is it really necessary? And what can we do to make your job better and easier? And so by doing that over time and affecting policy change over time, I feel like I can do, you know, as one individual, you can only do so much, but by working in that policy realm, I feel like I'm helping so many more people that it's kind of like I'm working through them. You know, my influence on the greater good is kind of, you know, through helping that collective body of professionals that are in the field doing that field work, if that makes sense.
Do you find that some of your ability to affect policy changes within the department is kind of, how much is it influenced by the legislature and like the current politics?
Our policy, I mean, it's trying to think, like, my first thought to answer your question, my first thought is, like, I've been just today I was corresponding with our legislative liaison who's working with a legislator who's drafting a bill and wanted some feedback on the bill. And so we actually went through a couple different rounds, iterations of what that bill language might say. And in the end, they accepted my input and they modified the bill. Whether or not the bill goes anywhere, time will tell. But this current legislature and our Department of Natural Resources is very interactive. I've had a lot of, over the last several years, a lot of opportunity to provide input on bills. So there's that, I guess, side of, that's at least the thought that came to my mind. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously, you know, we're an agency that has, you know, a policy-making board that's appointed by the governor. So we have that. So there's definitely a political, like, I mean, if you've been paying attention to the wolf hunt and all that's going on there, I mean, certainly that's a good example of how politics can kind of come into play when it comes to wildlife management and resource management. So yeah, Jason.
So you'd mentioned how important it was when you were working in Milwaukee that you had had these kind of contacts with the media,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a pretty influential part of your path. What advice do you have for folks that are like pretty early in their career about ways to engage media that are maybe like not real high risk, right, but just start to become comfortable interacting with folks on various media platforms?
Well, my experience with the media has always been, I guess, first of all, to if you can, you know, get the requests, the questions from them in advance so that you're prepared. Answer the questions that they ask. Don't ramble, because sometimes, you know, they want to, then that's the rambling is what they're going to put on camera. Also, though, I had so much camera time, I mean, in the studio, and, you know, having that, you know, yes, you've got, you know, a reporter and a camera, you know, behind them, but really just kind of ignoring the camera and just, you know, looking at the person and having that personal interaction as if the camera isn't there. It's almost like the art form, you know, that you just kind of, it's hard to do that, but that's really ultimately what I did. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to have a conversation with this reporter now. I'm just going to pretend like this camera isn't here, and that worked really well for me. It was definitely a lot of favorable feedback with that kind of an approach. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, that, I don't know, maybe gives me some ideas for future state level technical work to go through some mock-up interviews with students with a real camera.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most frustrating things is when a reporter says, hey, can I come interview you about, you know, fill in the blank? And then they show up and they're like, so what can you tell me about fill in the blank? And I'm like, well, what do you want to know? You know, what questions do you have? You know, so kind of making them work for it is an important thing too. Know that you're in control, I guess is the bottom line. I think people, when you work with the media, you have a tendency to feel like, oh my God, you know, I got to talk to this reporter, you know, and you just, you know, there's a tendency to kind of build up this like anxiety, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be on camera and they're going to ask me questions, and you know, and instead you just got to like take a step back and go, okay, I'm in control here. Actually, what questions do you want to talk about? What do you want to ask me? No, that question, you know, no, you can't go there. I'm not going to answer that. You know, or even when they ask you a question and if you don't know the answer, you can simply just say, you know, I'm not going to answer that question, and they're not going to put that on camera. Because sometimes they try to bait you. Yes?
You ever had where they try to like twist your words on a very specific topic, like when you talked about mentioning like COVID-19 and West Nile virus?
Nothing that egregious, I would say, but there has been some misrepresentation or misquotes where I've had to work with the Office of Communications to like either have them print a retraction or a correction to that. So that I've experienced that. Well, I hope this is what you were looking for today. Again, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and I wish you all well in your goals and aspirations and your career paths. And next thing you know, it's going to be 28 years, and you're going to be like, holy cow, where'd that time go? So thanks so much.
I think many of you do have to get rolling along, but I think Tammy has a little time afterwards
Sure.
to answer some specific questions or interact with you and Rich afterwards. So thanks all for coming. We'll see you again November 9th.